We're gonna get started whenever you're ready, Brian.
Oh, okay. Sure. So Evanique and I have taken on the topic of the divine feminine, and to do that, we're focusing on a book by Isabella Price. I like that book because it's it doesn't have an obvious agenda. Most of the stories in there, I think, are presented without a strong point of view attached. She does draw some conclusions, but I don't think she has a clear agenda. So, if you will, her conclusions are based on facts, not the other way around. And but we're getting away from that this week because there was a lot of questions last week from a lot of people. What happened to the goddesses? Because everybody likes the goddesses. In fact, everybody liked the goddesses, it seems. So I agreed to take, Evanique and I agreed to take on that topic, and I went ahead and put together the PowerPoint for tonight. It does look at that issue. It's a little bit different in another way, in that the goddesses, when we talk about the goddesses, it tends to evoke positive feelings about the attributes of the goddess. The goddess quest is one. A couple that I would add based on this evening, but also the previous ones, is nature, justice, emotions. So these there's kind of a positive message, I think, coming from the goddesses this evening. I hope we can find a positive message, but a lot of the texts that I look at talk about the disappearance of the goddess in a somewhat negative way. So I try to take a more nuanced view on that. And I guess the last point I would make is in sticking to the Isabella Price text, I kind of avoid the subject that I'm not really, I haven't committed my life to studying goddesses, and I'm not an expert in that area. I don't have a profession in that area. It's not my full-time employment. So I clearly have omissions in my understanding, and I might even have misunderstandings. I try to finesse that by using just the one book and presenting Isabella Price's views. This evening, I've had to go a bit beyond a single text. I will show you the main text I used in a minute. We'll have to go beyond a single text and put together things that I've read recently and over time. So there are facts in here that I think are pretty well established in my reading, and some I've run across only once or twice. In addition to that, as you all know, a lot of this material is still subject to study, research, and change, even among the scholars. So if anybody has additional information or even different information, I'd really appreciate if they brought that out. And I guess maybe on this last point, that'd really be useful, because in preparing, I thought it would be most useful to answer this question, what happened to the goddesses, if I really focused in on a couple, what I thought were really crucial areas. Now, David Miller's already touched on another one this evening, so there clearly are more. If people want to bring those up, that would really be greatly appreciated. My focus has been on early Iron Age, what I call the change in hierarchies of the Greek gods and goddesses in Athens, and that's in the early Iron Age. And then the second is the suppression of Asherah in Jerusalem, again in the early Iron Age. So those two are obviously don't cover the field, but I think they're great examples, and they help me to bring out what I think are some useful points. Before we get into the slides, some of which I've already anticipated, I will say that the only thing I've been able to write up for this evening is the goddesses, the Greek goddess story, and I think that's going to carry us through this evening. If it doesn't, we can get into the Jewish story. I'm glad to do that. I've got it all prepared. I just haven't had time to write it up. What I think will happen is that we won't get into the what happened to Asherah in Jerusalem until next week. Okay, do we have PowerPoints?
Yes, let me share my screen.
In the meantime, Evanique and I both really thank everybody here and encourage you again to contribute. There is, obviously at the end there'll be discussions, but also during the presentation, Evanique will be watching that, but there'll be, she'll kind of manage the comments and questions, but there'll definitely be opportunities for comments and questions throughout, including Evanique is going to go ahead and raise. Together, I think Penny's got some of her own observations. So let's get started. What happened to the goddesses? And here I'm focusing on Western traditions because what?
Brian, one thing, I'm just going to mute everybody. Just give me 1 second. Okay, you can go ahead now.
Okay, so the question is, what happened to the goddesses? A very broad topic. The really goes around the world because there have been goddesses and still are goddesses around the world. But to keep it real and I think responsive to the questions that were asked, I've focused on the Western traditions. As we work through the Isabella Price book, we're going to also touch on the Indian tradition. And obviously there are many more, some of them current and contemporary throughout the world. Anthropologists tend to pick up on those. And also the cultural, the historical, like the Celtic and the Nordic, as well as other historical beliefs, mythical systems around the world. So this really is just a sample, but I think it's indicative of certainly what's happened in the West and what I think is of most interest and importance to the audience here. The book I'm using is called A History of the Goddess. A History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible. A History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible, written by an author named Edward Dodge. Edward Dodge, just like the car, D-O-D-G. It's published in 2021, so it's recent research. He's been working on this book for years. He also is not a professional scholar. He actually is a renewable energy consultant in Washington, D.C. Has degrees from Cornell University. And I'll just say kind of by the way that I found a lot of the better books in this area, ancient thinking, are often written by people who have a very broad view. And I really like his approach. I think it's very comprehensive, but at the same time, he incorporates history, literature, religion, a lot of different disciplines, geography and archaeology, a lot of different perspectives on this topic, and I think he's done a good job with it. So what I've written is based mainly on what he'd done, but not exclusively. So the preliminary remarks, the benefits of this series is hopefully to raise awareness and express gratitude for the divine feminine. And then importantly, I've already flagged that, provide a forum where participants are encouraged to speak. The next one is to speak about, and these are specific, I would say specific takeaways that have already come out of the series, learning about goddess quests as a complement to hero journeys. We hear a lot about hero journeys, but not goddess quests, and there are a lot of examples of those in the literature. Inanna went to the underworld. Isis retrieved her husband a couple of times from death. So there are a lot of examples of this. Could we have the next slide? And then other benefits, learning about the sacred marriage. Again, I think that's already a takeaway, which I think to me is a big takeaway. It's one of the first reasons I got interested in this area. Sharing capabilities, Isis and Osiris and Inanna and Dumuzi, her god husband, also illustrate that in the goddess traditions, there tends to be a sharing of capabilities and responsibilities in a complementary manner. So goddesses tend to incorporate gods. And of course, if you look at it conversely, in that period of time, gods also tended to, God views tended to accommodate and incorporate goddesses. It's more like a yin and yang understanding. A couple more I'd add to that, based on my readings for this evening, is I think obviously nature, which has been kind of a subtext in a lot of these with Isis and Inanna. Nature is clearly important. The emotions and the importance of emotions, and then justice comes out as a topic which goddesses take the lead in the Greek tradition. Okay, and then this really gets into what we're doing this. Oh, can we just go back? I would do this myself, but I haven't figured out yet how. The significance of the divine feminine for contemporary religion, both in her presence and absence. And that kind of gets into what we're doing this evening. We're trying to identify the significance of the fact that goddesses have, to some extent, have been downplayed in our current spiritual lives. And then also to identify topics for individual further reading and discussion, actually individually or as a group. That's how that was the genesis of this meeting, for example. People demonstrated a real interest in this topic. So here we're this evening trying to better understand the causes and significance of the current absence and presence of goddesses. Over time and more, I guess more intensely recently, I've read a lot of books, or let's say several books on this topic. So this is, there really is, if you want to look into it, there's a lot on this, written from many, many different perspectives: feminist, historical, archaeological, religious, mythological, anthropological. It's really an interesting topic. Okay. So I'm focusing this evening on, as I said, the early Iron Age is, I think, a crucial period. And then two places, Athens, in the end, we'll do Athens and Jerusalem. This evening, I'll talk first of all about Athens, and we'll get into Jerusalem as possible. I think both Athens and Jerusalem were subject to influences from the period of time that we're looking at. Slightly different and occurring at slightly different times, but in the early Iron Age and then beyond, we saw, I would say, we tended to see a decline in the goddesses. And there are many different reasons for that. I guess a key word I would say is that there the period of time between the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age was a tumultuous period that many people would refer to as the ancient Dark Ages, kind of like the Dark Ages that occurred in, that people used to call, that occurred in Europe. We're really filling in the blanks on what happened in the Dark Ages. And so it's also true that we're filling in the blanks in what happened between the collapse of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. The Iron Age got rolling slowly and took centuries and in different times in different places, and it manifested itself in different ways. But I think there's some overriding observations that can be made, and maybe after I present these, we can get into some of the, if people have things to add in this area, it'd be greatly welcomed, or comments and criticisms about this. So I think the key word is tumultuous. There was a collapse of the Bronze Age in around the 1100, maybe more or less 1100 BC. Again, it happened slightly different times at different places, but it led to the end of the Hittite Empire, which was a huge empire, the end of the Mycenaean Empire in Greece, if you want to call that an empire, the end of the old Assyrian Empire, although that was one of the few empires that actually survived and was the first to revive as a strong empire in the Fertile Crescent during the Iron Age. And then you had Egypt, which also survived, but really went into a period of, again, I don't want to say chaos, but decline that lasted really until the Iron Age was gaining steam. And then the final area to mention is the Levant, where again there were a lot of city-states, and these city-states, most of them were destroyed, just like the capitals of these empires. The one empire that wasn't touched, the capital wasn't touched, was Egypt. I don't think they got to the Assyrian Empire either, but these sea peoples came from the west and swept through Greece, the southern coastal areas, and up into the central plateau of Turkey, and then down through what people call the Levant, where the Canaanites lived. And there were a lot of city-states there. It's a relatively narrow strip of fertile land. It was conducive to the growth of cities, basically between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. But further than the Sea of Galilee, further north than the Sea of Galilee, and about as far south as the Dead Sea. There were a lot of cities there. Ugarit was a big city. Sidon, Tyre, Ascalon. There were just a whole series of cities that developed more or less on the coast, some of them very important in the Bronze Age trade. But they were destroyed, practically all of them. And there are different people come up with different reasons why that happened. A big one now, I guess, because people are sensitive to that issue, is climate change. Really, there has, even before the awareness of the current climate age, there was research on the climate change in the Middle East, and there is evidence that there was a significant climate change that contributed to the fall of the Bronze Age cities and empires. There are other reasons. People talk about a pandemic, people talk about volcanic activity. There are different reasons that are mentioned, but I think I think there's kind of a consensus that it led to these people sweeping in from, people aren't entirely sure where, some or all of the following places: Thrace, the Balkans, Italy, Sicily. That in any or all of these places, there were these pirates, in effect, that rolled up and formed, by the time they had reached Turkey, had formed a rather large body. And it wasn't just the men, it was also whole families that were moving, which lends credence to the idea of some kind of a climate crisis. In any event, it's really the sea people that there's some consensus about. And I think the takeaway from that is that there were a lot more conflicts, battles, and wars that arose as these people came through. Then the second thing is that they settled throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, bringing new cultures, new gods, and new goddesses. It's not all new gods and goddesses, but clearly a new cultural influence. Another big influence was the development of iron itself. Iron weapons are stronger than bronze weapons. And I think it's clear the sea peoples had mastered ironwork, whereas some of the other civilizations had not. Plus, iron is more readily available in many different places. So it's quite possible that in Sicily, Italy, Thrace, the Balkans, certainly the Balkans, there were a lot of people who had mastered the metallurgy of iron and made these weapons, which gave them an advantage over the Eastern Mediterranean people. Again, that led to a lot more war. And one of the phenomenon is that the continuing rise of kingship. I won't say that it didn't start with the Iron Age. Kingship goes back to even the Copper Age, where cities, I think it's attested in the literature that, and in the historical documents, that cities in Sumeria and Mesopotamia would appoint a king on a temporary basis if there was a national emergency, in particular a military threat. And then he would pull together men to go fight in this conflict. That really is that comports, for example, with the story of Gilgamesh, who was, and he's considered, some people, I'd say many people consider him to be an actual historical figure who's captured in this myth of Gilgamesh, but that's exactly the way he became king. There was a threat and he was appointed by a council as king, and he dealt with the threat, but on the agreement that he would then be king after the threat was dealt with. That wasn't always the case, but that became the case more and more. It used to be the king was temporary just during the national emergency, and then they were installed for longer periods. So I mentioned that because that tended to be a role of men rather than women. And a lot of the evolutions in gods and goddesses reflect, number one, the understanding of nature, which tended to be more static and, not static, but cyclical, not changing much over the cycles. But then second, the growth of institutions and civilization, which did evolve, not necessarily in a cyclical manner, with the growth of cities and the more frequent and violent confrontations. So I think that the prominence of men increased. One example of that is that in the Sumerian king list, which again goes way back before the Iron Age, there are no women kings. It's all men kings, even though there were a lot of women goddesses at that time. Plus, again, I want to touch on something other than the early Iron Age here. you'll also see that there's throughout the history of the Sumerian Akkad, the gods as opposed to goddesses assume more and more influence, and it was particularly in respect of wars and the cities where war had been prominent in their establishment. So Enlil was the king of Akkad, and Akkad was the capital city of what most people consider the first empire. That's the empire of Sargon. And then there's Marduk, a very important god, who really was installed as the most important god in Babylon by Hammurabi, who conquered the city. He was from a Semitic tribe that came, the Amorites, that came in from marginal lands and conquered Babylon, and they established Marduk as their god. And there are other examples of this, but as war became, I think, more prominent, and there is other evidence that it did, you have the growth of gods over goddesses. I guess the one thing I'd add to that is there's a goddess, a Canaanite goddess called Anat, who was, I think, a sister of Asherah that we'll talk about later. She's a war goddess, and that does exist. Athena was a war goddess, but they describe her, for example, as slaughtering men with your sword and bow and arrow, and then standing in blood up to her knees in their blood. That just doesn't sound realistic to me. I mean, even in an exaggerated way. I think it's the only attested female warriors that existed in those days were the Scythians, who are mentioned, as I recall, by Herodotus, and were the source of the Amazon mythology that developed among the Greeks. So I don't think it's more the exception that women were fighting in the wars than the men. So number one is the wars. Number two is developments in agriculture, where again, the iron played a big role with the development of the plow. The iron plow is a lot stronger than a wooden, bronze, or copper plow. You can make a bigger plow, and it could be pulled by bigger animals or by an animal at all. A lot of the others were handled by hand. So that in the prehistoric times, women were gatherers and men were the hunters. When we had the development of early agriculture, the women, in my opinion, the women transitioned into taking the lead on planting, poking sticks in the ground or wooden hoes in a relatively small space. But when you have the advent of the iron plow, the men would take over more. But number one, it's a lot heavier. And men tend to be bigger and stronger. And then number two, they were the hunters, and they tended to transition to the herding. I don't think that's none of these are universal statements, but I think it's pretty clear that men were associated with herding, and that ties in nicely with the husbandry of these farm animals, especially the big water buffalo that were used in plowing. Then the next developments are new industries and the increase in sea trade. I already mentioned steel mining. I think mining increased significantly in the Iron Age, became more geographically diverse. The importance of iron and smelting, and other industries that also grew, plus the increase in sea trade. I really haven't run across this a lot, but it occurs to me that most sailors are men. And as the commerce grew in the early Iron Age, the Phoenicians, for example, grew all the way to the Straits of Gibraltar and beyond. They established huge colonies in Carthage and in Spain, or in Africa, the Carthage and in Spain. Those tended to be the undertakings of men until you started the colonization, and then women were brought in. Also, the Greeks were very big on seafaring, which I think in the first instance was men, and then colonization. And if you read about that, you'll see that typically it's the men who did the initial exploration, and women were brought in when colonization began. So again, I think you see the prominence or ascendance of men over women with some of these technological and cultural developments, which I think led to the decline of the goddesses. And then finally, just as with the sea peoples, which were a threat to these civilizations, the cities that existed in the more fertile areas, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt, you also have the nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes. The Amorites I already mentioned. They tended to be herders, but if there were decline in or changes in the climate, they would be driven closer and closer to the cities, and they do have a tradition of raiding as a way of supporting themselves. It's very similar to Genghis Khan. Plus, the same is true of, if you will, at least based on the biblical accounts, is true of the Hebrews. They came in from marginal lands and just totally destroyed cities in Canaan, including killing all the men, women, and children. So again, you have the nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples who came not from the west, but came in from the east, that added to the chaos and tumult of this period of time. And I think that led to an increase in the importance of men and decline of goddesses. So those are overriding considerations that I think are important for understanding Athens and Jerusalem. If anybody else has additional or different information, I would really like to hear it.
If anyone has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. All right. Seeing nothing, we're going to move on to the next slide.
All right. So now I'm going to go from the very general to the very specific and tell the story of the decline of goddesses in Athens using the trilogy play that was written by Aeschylus called I'm going to pronounce it Oresteia, to distinguish it from Orestes, who's one of the characters that appears in the play. I think it's a great example. It's in the book by Edward Dodge, and it covers a transition from one goddess to another goddess. So it's kind of a variation on the theme, which I think is important to keep in mind. The replacement of gods or goddesses by gods is one of the trends that was occurring at this time. It's not the one I want to focus on, but it can be equally important and is an illustration of other important factors. So I'm going to more or less read this so you get the story. Orestia was a courtroom play written by Aeschylus in 458 BC. And that's interesting because it's about the same year that Ezra completed the Jewish Bible. The completion of the Jewish Bible, I think, is a very big event in world history, and it happened at about the same time. There's been a lot of study on which books of the Bible were written when, but I think people tend to agree that not the last, but one of the last revisions of the Pentateuch occurred here at this time. So if we want to understand what happened in Jerusalem in the early Iron Age and before, we tend to see it through the lens written by Ezra, or at least revised by him and his scribes. So this period of time is very important, and these are Orestia and the Jewish Bible, as promulgated by Ezra, I think are great resources for us. All right, another thing was it was written. These both Aeschylus and the Ezra's revision of the Bible were written during the Axial Age, which is a term coined by Karl Jaspers, a German philosopher from the 20th century, and he's pointing to shifts away from. He points to there are a lot of things in the Axial Age, but I think for our purposes, it tends to be a shift away. One thing that I'll try to point out earlier, a bit of a shift away from embodied virtues and gods to metaphors. The play captures two shifts in Athenian culture, and both of these shifts involve goddesses. It's number one is a shift away from vengeance murders to jury trials. The second is a shift from a matrilineal society to a patrilineal society. Now, this first one, vengeance murders were retribution murders committed by and against clan members. So if there was a patricide, let's say the son killed the father, then the mother would avenge, would be called upon to avenge. Or if the father killed the daughter, the mother was duty bound to avenge the killing. That's the rule that was within the clan society. And there was a shift in this play, a shift captured in this play from that kind of sense of justice, to justice that's based on trial by jury, and the jury is composed of fellow citizens. This ties in with another change in Athens. I don't remember the governor who did this, but he took the different clans. As they grew bigger, they tended to be understood as tribes, but they're just extended families that existed in Athens, and he divided them into 10 different districts in an attempt to break the power of the clans. So there was an effort in the Athenian polity to break the power of the clans, and this is just another example of that. So historically, vengeance murders in Greek mythology were associated with goddesses. And those goddesses were Rhea, that's the wife of Uranus, and the Furies. And we're going to talk more about the Furies this evening. You probably have heard of the Furies because we get the idea furious, or the words furious and fury from this word. And then there's also a shift from the matrilineal to the patrilineal, as I said, and that's articulated by Athena in her reasoning for a final judgment in this case that involves the murder of a mother by a son. So one important point to make is that matrilineal societies we're not quite like patrilineal societies in that patrilineal tends to have transfer of property exclusively through the men. Matrilineal tended to have transfers of property from one generation to the next, both through men and through women. So it's just more flexible in that way. It included women. Matrilineal included women, but wasn't limited to them. Okay. Are there any questions or comments about that?
Uh, I don't see anything in the chat, so we can move on to the next slide.
All right. So here's the story. I think I have 7 slides on it. In Orestia, it starts out with Agamemnon, a Mycenaean king, sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia. Agamemnon was preparing to sail for Troy. This is part of the Iliad, preparing to sail for Troy to recapture Helen. Helen was the sister of Queen Clytemnestra. Oh, I didn't spell that. Yeah, I got that right. Queen Clytemnestra, who not obviously, but she was Agamemnon's wife. Now, unfortunately, Agamemnon had angered Artemis, a goddess, for hunting deer on her sacred grounds. So for that reason, Artemis calmed the winds and prevented Agamemnon's war fleet from sailing towards Troy. To obtain Artemis's favor and the favorable winds, Agamemnon sacrificed his teenage daughter to Artemis. So a blood sacrifice, at an altar. The way he did that was he told Artemis that she was going to be marrying Achilles. And she showed up ready for a marriage, but that was just a trick, and she was sacrificed. Clytemnestra was not happy about that. So I guess the one thing I'll touch on, Artemis is a goddess. She's a goddess associated with nature, plants, animals, not so much the seasons, but also obviously here with hunting. So I think we're ready for the next slide. So based on the old, if you will, the old regime, Clytemnestra is obligated to avenge her daughter's death. At least she felt she was obligated, and certainly had support for that in the general community. So in the matriarchal society of that time, Clytemnestra is obligated to avenge the death of her daughter Iphigenia. So upon Agamemnon's return from the war, Clytemnestra dutifully kills her husband and announces the death publicly, and declaring that she had the right and obligation to vengeance as queen. So I think more generally as mother. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. Orestes then avenges his father's death. And you see how these, the clan murders, his father was Agamemnon. These clan murders tended to snowball, or at least go on and on. Sometimes they would snowball in unfortunate ways. So there was a belief that these vengeance murders were the way of justice. It was the process for achieving justice. But as you can see, it was a bloody affair that led to on occasion, many people dying. So Orestes is the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. Just by the way, Electra is their daughter, so the sister of Orestes. Electra helps Orestes escape from his mother's wrath. So this play is not just about men against women. Electra is also helping out Orestes so that he can save his life. Apollo then orders Orestes to avenge the murder of Agamemnon. So here we are, this is the old vengeance killing again. So Orestes returns home from his safekeeping, from his refuge, and with Electra's help, Orestes kills Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. Now, I think that's an important detail because one of the hallmarks or a common trait of the goddess worship, goddess cults, goddess religion, is that women tended to be there was no monogamy. So women would sleep with different people. That's partly tied into the fact that of matrilineal property inheritance. If a woman had property, it didn't matter who the father was. The property just went to the mother's children. So that, if you will, that was the financial aspect of the matrilineal and the financial aspect of the promiscuity or the polygamous arrangements. I don't think it's right to call it polygamous because they didn't have more than one husband. So then Orestes returns home. With Electra's help, Orestes kills Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. There's no family left to avenge Clytemnestra's death. Electra's not going to do it. So the Furies themselves, the spirits of vengeance, swear to avenge Clytemnestra's death. Okay, we can go to the next slide. The Furies then pursue Orestes. So these goddesses, there's three of them, pursue Orestes. I have a cameo vignette about them later after the play, so we understand them better. But for now, you just need to know that these three goddesses were pursuing Orestes, but he escapes from them. So Orestes, I'm going to read the first line here. Orestes escapes to Apollo's temple in Delphi. Remember, Apollo told him to avenge his father's death. Apollo is the god of divination, and Delphi is the home of the Pythia. The Pythia are Apollo's priestesses, and they can foretell the future. You probably remember that they do that in cryptic and mysterious terms. I put that in here because typically in the Bronze Age, the divinity or the deity of divination tended to be a woman. And here you see in the early Bronze Age, Apollo and Athena are early Bronze Age, early Iron Age gods. There's a switch here. The divination is with a man and not with a woman. But the priestesses are all the people who actually foretell the future are all women. All right, the next line here, the Furies pursue Orestes and torment him with their ceaseless singing and death threats. So we'll get into this later, but it's they really capture the psychological element of again, this is of justice. The Furies were seen as a form of justice by the Bronze Age Greeks, and we'll get into that more later. Apollo tells Orestes to run away to Athena's temple in Athens. Apollo and Athena are both the early Iron Age gods and goddesses, and they're brother and sister. They're both born of Zeus, who's also a third generation god in the Greek pantheon. So Orthes, that just underlines the fact that these are young gods and goddesses. Orestes then does so. He runs to Athena's temple. And Apollo says that he will protect Orestes on the way to Athena's temple, and he does that. So then the Furies express their disgust and anger with Apollo. Of course, that's what they do. They get angry about the things. And but then they go on. This is interesting. They denounce him as a new young god who does not respect the ancient traditions of vengeance murder, which is justice. It's their understanding of justice. So this shows how we're moving from one era, if you will, that where the predominant social institution is the clan, and we're moving more towards the city, a civic view. So after this exchange, the Furies, after the Furies express their disgust with Apollo, the Furies depart from Delphi and follow Orestes to Athena's temple in Athens. So brother and sister, god and goddess, both young Iron Age creations. Go to the next slide. Athena institutes trial by jury over vengeance. So here we have a goddess who's superseding other goddesses. It's not just Apollo, it's also Athena who's playing a role in this. Both Orestes and the Furies arrive at Athena's temple in Athens. The Furies denounce Orestes before Athena, and they plead to be allowed to kill him. And Orestes pleads for his life. Athena announces that the matter is too great for her to decide, so she institutes the first murder trial by jury. I couldn't really say it was the first trial by jury. I don't really know that that's part of the story. There may have been trials for other matters, so she might not have invented the institution of trial, but this is supposedly the first murder trial by jury. And the jury is composed of citizens of Athens, very different from clans. In fact, there were no citizens of Athens until the governor had come in and reorganized the city so that the clans were broken up and districts of citizens were created. And in addition to switching from clans to citizens, there's a shift to hearing evidence and arguments, and the jury decides. So the jury will hear evidence and arguments presented both by the Furies as prosecutors and by Apollo. Apollo is Orestes' defense counsel, and then the jury gets to decide. So this is very similar to what we have today. There have been a lot of changes in jury trials over the ages, but it's really interesting to see how this element is the same between our current practice and the very first trials in Athens. Okay. Now here's the interesting thing. When Apollo makes his argument, now we've got arguments. We don't have somebody like the Furies or Clytemnestra who's drawing her own conclusions based on the facts and then going out and avenging a murder. You know, I think there's no doubt that Agamemnon had killed Iphigenia, so there's no question about the facts, but the process is very different. Plus, there's no real arguments about it. There's no chance to discuss it. And but here with the jury trial, with the jury hearing evidence and arguments, Apollo's able to give a reason why Orestes should not be killed or punished for murdering his mother. And this is what he says. The mother of what is called her child is not the parent, but merely the nurse of the newly sown embryo. And here's a little longer quote. Not the true parent is the woman's womb that bears the child. She doth but nurse the seed newly sown. The man alone is parent, and she for him, as stranger for a stranger, merely nurtures his germ of life. And when I first read that, I just was blown away. But this is sweeping away the matrilineal approach to society and attributing to taking a patrilineal approach, which excludes the mothers from rights in the family, including the property rights and including these vengeance rights. Okay. And then the next thing, which to me is equally surprising, Athena accepts Apollo's argument against mothers. Apollo's argument splits the jury evenly. So Athena gets to decide the case, and she votes to accept Apollo's argument. So both the goddess and the god are taking the patrilineal approach over the matrilineal. Athena, who was born directly from Zeus's head, not out of a womb, states that she will always favor men over women. And here's her quote: "Mine is the right to add the final vote, and I award it to Orestes' course. No mother bore me within her womb. I vouch myself the champion of the man, not the woman, and I do so with all my soul. In my heart, as in my birth, I am a father's child alone." So that is a rather sweeping and definitive statement by a goddess who's really deferring to a patrilineal arrangement. So to me, this is just a really, really surprising evolution that's captured here by Aeschylus in his play. Can we go on to the next? So, reflections on Orestes. What is the fate of goddesses and women in this trilogy? Orestes reflects the creation of the jury trial in Athens. We've already talked about that. Trial by jury is instituted by a goddess and is seen as an advancement over vengeance killings among clan members. So here a goddess is becoming ascendant in the early Iron Age, as opposed to declining. And the creation of the jury trial is a triumph for the goddess Athena. But what about the other women and other goddesses in Oresteia? So Iphigenia is sacrificed. And really there's very little, after the vengeance killing, there's very little discussion of her. Artemis, the nature god, is appeased and sends wind for Agamemnon's war fleet. But otherwise, so she, in summary, she retains her realm and powers in this play. And later we'll get into it in history as well. She will be repressed by the Christians in 401 in the Common Era. It's documented that a Christian mob destroyed her temple in Ephesus, which is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Clytemnestra avenges her daughter's death. She and her lover are later killed by her son. So they are epitomizing the older approach, which has been swept away by Athena. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And here I want to look at the Furies, because I think this is again interesting. I've already made what I think is an important point for this presentation, that one goddess is superseding another goddess. So it's not always the gods superseding the goddesses. It's one goddess who embodies newer institutions is sweeping away the old goddesses who embody the older institutions. And here it says, the Furies' vengeful approach to kindred murder is replaced with trial by jury. In other words, one goddess over another. Athena has eclipsed the other goddesses, the Furies. Really, I'm just repeating what I've already said. So it's not always the gods who eclipse goddesses. And I think that's to me, a big takeaway from this play. I think often when you read about this, if you want to read about, I'll just make a footnote here. If you start reading about, with the intent of understanding the decline of the goddesses, which was a question that was presented to me, there's a lot of literature out there that talks only about gods superseding goddesses. And it leaves you with the impression that that's all that was happening, but that's not true. There was new institutions, and the the gods that represented their spirit, gods and goddesses that represented their spirit, tended to sweep away the old gods and goddesses that were representing the old institutions. Now, some of the, nature is not swept away. So nature remains, and a lot of these nature goddesses remain until a later date, as epitomized by Artemis. Okay. Reflections. Okay, what is the fate of other goddesses? Athena, what's the fate of goddesses and women in the trilogy? Athena states that mothers are not parents. So it's not only Athena that's instituting trial by jury, the new institution based on citizens rather than clans. It is, she's saying that mothers are not parents. So this is really a very second different point. And this, I think, clearly is establishing men as more ascendant than women, but it's interesting that a goddess is doing it. So again, it's a mixed, I think this is a very mixed bag. I think in general, there is a trend away, as I outlined at the very beginning, in the early Iron Age, a trend away from goddesses to gods. It was a tumultuous period for all the reasons I outlined: tumult and developments in industry, sea trade. So even though Athena is a goddess, Athena clearly and emphatically relegates women to an inferior role, at least within the scope of her powers. That's another thing to remember, is that she was just the goddess of Athens, wisdom and war and peace. She was also goddess of handicrafts. And it's not clear that she favored men in the handicrafts, but certainly in the areas of wisdom and war and peace. Now, again, that's still subject to discussion, but I think that's a defensible statement. Well, that leads me to another point that I might have made earlier. The gods and goddesses also tended to represent certain cities. And if a city was a city that was represented by a woman by a goddess was ascendant, well, then the goddesses of that city would tend to eclipse the gods in neighboring towns. And conversely, if a town was represented by a god, and the city was represented by a god, and the neighboring towns and countryside were represented by goddesses, then the god would eclipse the goddesses as they became more important. And that is clearer, much clearer, when you look at the history of Asherah in Jerusalem. There was a lot of goddess worship in and around Jerusalem. But when the Yahwist returned, not just when the Yahwist returned from Babylon, even before, but certainly when the Yahwist returned from Babylon, they did their best to eliminate that worship. So it was, as Jerusalem became more important, it more or less swept away the goddesses that were loved in the countryside. Okay. All right, another focus on Athena in a slightly different way. And here's the first paragraph there just says that she's a new Iron Age god rather than a Bronze Age god. So reflecting new institutions, kind of new mentalities. But also she has a different character, and that's in the second paragraph. She is wise, she's civilized, and the patron of domestic arts like weaving. She is chaste, not promiscuous. So that's something that is more consistent with a patrilineal approach to families and property. So she's more in line with, as with her ruling in the case, her character is in line with this patrilineal approach. She even celebrates her virginity and restrained sexuality. And she embodies wisdom. So a woman a goddess is embodying wisdom. That there's also a strong tradition in the Jewish tradition that women embody wisdom. But she, Athena, is born from the skull of Zeus. So this wisdom is represented as being derived directly from a male godhead. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Let's see, does anybody have any comments or questions at this point? Is there anything there?
Looks like somebody is.
There's a question. Is there evidence, if anyone has any question, okay, is there evidence of the origins of gods and goddesses outside the plays as sources? Or were they the invention of storytellers? Well, there was, yes, this is just one example. The sources of Greek mythology are varied. You have Hesiod, who wrote really a very long poem about the origin of the gods. You have epic poetry like, which is really more of a story rather than a recounting. An epic, a story that incidentally touches on the gods, that's the Iliad and the Odyssey, but they play key roles in that. And so the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey becomes a story for those gods and goddesses as well. And we learn a lot about them. And then you have these plays, which capture some mythology that may not be captured elsewhere. And probably moves along some of the stories of gods and goddesses. I really haven't looked into that. You also have something in the Greeks that that didn't exist as far as I know in the Mesopotamian, the Levant. You had initiation rituals where individuals were introduced to a cult through an initiation process, where they'd go to a certain place. They didn't tend to be temples. They were more, it's really more like a spa, but just a place that's removed, like Ulyssia or Labos, or some of the Greek islands you would go to, and there would be an initiation rite that was instituted to introduce the initiants to the cult of a certain god. And the Elysian rites were very important. Also, the rites surrounding Dionysus were important, and his wedding to Ariadne. That, in fact, was a very popular one. Some of these things continued into the Roman times, and you could call it a pilgrimage that people went to, but in some ways it was like a trip to Disney World or Disneyland. You know, they had a different approach to these. It wasn't like a pilgrimage, a Christian pilgrimage to a remote monastery. A big group of people would show up and they would engage in these rituals. And then there's stories, there's knowledge about the gods and goddesses that is embedded in these rituals. Some of that knowledge is not even known today because initiates were often sworn to secrecy. And then I guess the final source of these stories that I can think of is like this play, and those can be tied in nicely with these rituals. In a ritual, an individual is taken through several steps that typically involve some, let's say it's like riding a roller coaster in Disney World. It's scary. It's supposed to transform you. in some way. It is an emotional experience. It involves fear or intoxication, exhilaration, ecstatic experiences, wild dancing, drinking wine, partying all night, different things. And but I think a key thing is that each initiate goes through the experience personally. And then drama developed out of that. In drama, it's not each initiate that goes through a prescribed experience. It's the initiates now become the audience, and they watch somebody else go through the experience. And that's called, and then they're supposed to be transformed emotionally by seeing it happen to somebody else. That's called catharsis. And then there's a lot more flexibility. And then you get these playwrights who come up with different stories, and I'm sure that they propagate and embellish these myths in the way illustrated here by Orestia. They had annual competitions on these dramas, just like there were annual initiations. And they even had prizes. Orestia won the prize in its year as the best play. Okay, I want to give here kind of a cameo on the Furies.
Oh, wait, Brian, Ella has a question.
Okay.
Oh, wait, sorry, I have to unmute everybody. Give me 1 second. Okay, Ella, you can unmute now.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the point you made, Brian, about patriarchy and all of the examples that ensued. I do think the theme is very powerful because I think that, you know, as a woman, I feel it, and I think it's systemic. And, you know, of course, we're trying to find out where it started because, you know, in the realization of the early goddess era, you know, what happened? So that's the question for me, what happened? And we're going over all the goddesses and the different things and how they were seen and so forth. And yeah, I just want to go even further back for one moment and point out that maybe, you know, this is a primal kind of thing that existed prior to the goddess era, even this patriarchy, and a deeper thing in the sense that, you know, our you know, according to Darwinism, our nearest relatives are chimpanzees and bonobos, and we have 99% of the same DNA. Taking that theory in mind, you know, male chimpanzees are very dominant over females and take their food, and you know, they, you know, impregnate the females, and the females have no choices over any of that conduct or behavior. I'm wondering if some of it is just an innate tendency to power, and it's systemic and it's worldwide. And so I appreciate the fact that we're trying to look at this together. And I particularly appreciate the examples of this systemic patriarchy through legal means, through, you know, holding women as slaves and being seen as sexual objects, and having much power and control over them. And even in the goddess era, the goddesses would initiate other women at the behest of other men in power to initiate young women in the temples for the purposes of sex for the men. And I'm not saying they didn't have power. We've talked about that. Obviously they did. But I'm wondering if this is a real deep and systemic thing that goes way back, and you know, am appreciative of anyone's insight on that particular topic.
Yeah, I'll just pause and see if others have something to say on that.
I could say something about that, just from what I have read in the books. And I mean, I see that it appears from what we're reading in the goddess books that, I mean, clearly physically men, you know, are bigger than women, etc. But there was a long period in history, starting maybe in the Paleolithic and definitely in the Neolithic, for thousands of years when the goddesses were supreme. And, you know, different reasons why they thought, but they thought a lot of it might be just simply because early people didn't understand how children or how, you know, were created. And so they clearly knew who the mother was. So the mother became the source of life. That's what the god and goddesses, basically the goddess is the source of life. She's the primary divinity. And so the children were, you know, traced through the mothers. And the civilizations, which, you know, were all over the Middle East and the Near East and other parts of the world, but a lot of the books focus on that. I mean, they existed for thousands of years, at least from, you know, 7,000 BC up to around 400 AD, when they were finally eliminated by in that world by the Greeks, and when the Roman emperors became Christian. So I'm not, to me, I don't think that it's just innate that humans maybe have you want to have power might be innate, but it seems like when you have thousands of years of history that it doesn't seem, perhaps, I think it seems a stretch to say that men have always, you know, dominated, just like because, you know, we're descended from the chimpanzees or the bonobos or something. I know.
Well, I'm sorry, but that was just, you know, I mean, no one knows, but that's certainly a possibility. But I think the facts are facts, and if it's clearly factual that women have been dominated, and so it's, you know, so we have an exception, as you're pointing out, in the earlier eras, but I'm wondering if that's actually true. If in fact, I mean, and it's good, it's nourishing to know that there were goddesses and at one point in time, but that still begs the question, what happened, and why did you know, were women you know, sold as slaves, had to give up ownership of property, you know, are, you know, just legally treated, they had to go join the husband's families. You know, I know earlier on they could choose their own, go with their the matriarchal tribe or with the paternal tribe, but later on, after farming started, they joined the man's family, and that weakens the mother. I mean, legally, they had no rights. So in general, I'm generalizing here, I'm sure there are exceptions throughout the world, but it's continued. And so there's some kind of essence I'm trying to get at there or discover. Appreciate any insights into how this has happened.
Well, I think one thing you have to realize is that there's power. There's a different dynamic of power. There's a power by force, which we can see throughout history is a male dominated, but women had a different type of power in wisdom. And we can see that in Western religions where when, in places such as the Bible, and even here in this story, Athena represents wisdom. And in the Bible, in Psalms and in Proverbs, wisdom is womanly. And you can see in the Bible that there were certain women that were powerful, that knew how to outsmart men. They knew they didn't have the strength, but for instance, Delilah and Samson, where, Delilah learns Samson's weakness, which is cutting of his hair. So I think there's a different dynamic. Now, as far as the chimpanzees, I don't know much about that part, but I think you can see in different stories, even though that, yes, there is a male dominance there, there's a power that a female has that allows, the female to take over in other ways. Even if it's seemingly like she doesn't have the power, there are many instances in many different books in the Western culture that show that, females do use their power. It's just a different kind of power. I wouldn't say it's a dominant power. I would just say it's a different type.
I think the laws should totally support women's rights to property.
But sorry, that's like for another meetup, but we have several people that are raising their hands.
I thought that was the purpose of the meeting. Okay, I apologize.
Oh, no worries. We're just sticking to the religion. We're not looking at laws around the world.
No,
right
I'm
now.
talking about throughout history. I'm not the history of the goddesses. The laws were male oriented after this particular. So if we're just talking about the goddess phase and we're not talking about patriarchy, I didn't realize that, because I see it as being a real dominant force that was present then and has continued.
Yeah. Thank you for your comments, Ella. So up next, I have Dave Dittlemore, followed by Jane. Dave, you're up.
Yeah, thanks, Evanique, and thanks for Brian for presenting tonight. I guess I get lower my hand. Yeah, a couple things. One, getting in the Bible a little bit. It's interesting to me that all this is taking place in Greece, as far as women being inferior and men taking over. That I, remember the story of Jesus talking to a woman at the well, who may have been a prostitute. If she was inferior, she wouldn't have been talking to him. And I think there were kind of women in his traveling group, although all the disciples were men, apparently. At least that's how the story was written. But it's interesting that the letters of Paul were to, I believe, churches in Greece, Thessalonica and Corinth, and et cetera, et cetera. And those are where it's stated that women are inferior. They're not to speak in church, always to be covered, and that a woman cannot teach a man. I thought that was very interesting to make that connection, that also kind of comes out of Greece. And the other thing I wanted to mention is the Iliad and the Odyssey. I kind of off on a little bit of a tangent, but for my study of PTSD, there's two books, Odysseus in Vietnam and anyway, another one in America, but talked about the Iliad and the Odyssey, about how many centuries old they are. But these stories are told after the battles were done between Athens and Troy. And it was kind of interesting that they didn't cast one side as good and the other side as evil, because it was told many years later, and there had been intermarrying and people had moved and things like that. And they were told by minstrels, entirely a oral tradition. It was not written down at that time. So we go from town to town and tell the story, the great story of the heroes and heroines. But anyway, interesting presentation. I thought I'd pass those couple things along. Thank you.
Thank you,
Evanique.
Dave. Up next, we have Jing, and then we're going to move on after Jing, because I know we have more. Jing, you're up.
Yeah, this is quite interesting to look at the history, see the progress, how the woman, because we all know even in history in China too, we all start with woman as the organizer of the society, but somehow it shifted. And I sent a link, it's quite interesting, it's about Tesla. And it's interesting how he was predicting about a lot of things, like internet was 100 years ago. And also he predicted women will dominate this internet. So that's what we see today. Like that's what Jordan Peterson was concerning about, how women have more and more power, men seem to have less power. But I think the history shows when the society, like the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, when society heavily rely on physical strength, women is in disadvantage. That's maybe the reason women lost their power gradually. But with internet and all the high technology, we see more advanced country like European country, a lot of women are leaders. My sister live in Germany, and it's funny, they said, because the chancellor was a woman, and the young men actually started out, if they've ever, they assume women always be the leader somehow in those countries. In German, they said. So it's kind of interesting, I think, how the history shifted. I think with the new, with the technology and all those will impact, because women are better organizer, have higher EQ in like communication. So maybe in the internet age, women have more advantage in that way. We no longer rely on physical strength anymore. So maybe we'll see another area of change of dynamic between man and woman.
Thank you, Jing. I really like the point of, you're showing the shifts of power throughout the ages and the different reasons for that, when, physical strength was more needed than the male took dominance. And I think it eventually balances itself out, right? You need men in certain areas, and you need male leadership. I wouldn't even say male leadership. I think you need male energy. And there are certain cases where you need feminine energy. And I think, just knowing what that is, and knowing that it's not meant to be dominating, but it's just meant to move forward. And
I want
ahead,
that very
Jane.
quickly. Sorry. Yeah. Also today, we no longer define by your male or female. Even male, they have their feminine energy. And some male maybe have more feminine energy than women, and maybe some women have more male energy. So I think it's kind of like how, my kids' age, they're much more fluid in many ways.
Thank you, Jane. Near, I see that you had put an exclamation point before I said we would move on. So did you want to speak now, or do you want to wait?
Sure, just briefly, if I may.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, it's just. I think there's interesting insights, but I think a lot of these, it's easy to get things oversimplified. So, I mean, for example, Apollo is known from the Bronze Age. I mean, he wasn't a new god in the Iron Age. He's known from Hittite texts from the late Bronze Age as a god. We know from for example, Hammurabi's code, which is well before in the Bronze Age, that it was quite patriarchal already then. So I think looking at these ages, there's a lot of complexity that is doesn't really fall in that categorization.
Thank you, Nir. So Brian, do you want to, are you done with this slide or do you want to say more before we?
I'll just say in summary, let's see about this. First of all, I want to thank Ella for her comments. I think after we do the history of the, I call it Jewish, but it's the Hebrew, Israeli, Yahwist Jewish tradition. I think that it's going to address more squarely some of her concerns, because the Greek, obviously, and I'll make that point in a minute here, is no longer a predominant religion in the West, whereas the Judeo-Christian is, and the Judeo-Christian, I think, is less, well, I've heard it in some of the tests, they refer to it as misogynistic. So I'm not sure I'd leave that up to you, but I think that the Jewish and Christian tradition that is going to be laid out might explain some of the observations that Ella has. Certainly the history is more consistent with her observations. And yeah, Nir's point's a good one. There are a lot. This is really an overview. When I refer to Apollo as an Iron Age god, he became more ascendant in the early Iron Age. That was it's really impossible. We're dealing with thousands of years of history that span from Sumeria to but before the end of this, the end of the Roman Empire. So it's really impossible to get into all the detail. And yes, there probably is as with many gods, there's a Hittite or other deity that presages or is really a precursor to these Greek gods. Astarte, a Phoenician goddess, is, I think, clearly a Bronze Age goddess, is a precursor to Aphrodite, for example. So there's so much interchange and there's synchronicity, and this really is a very simple simple generalization to try to raise appropriate issues in this context. So on this slide, the only point I would make, I'm focusing now on the Furies, which I think is just really interesting. So I might try to go through it quickly and get into points I think Ella might find more interesting, and really complete the story for this evening. And then looks like we won't get to the Jewish Christian history until next week, and that I think will complete the picture and answer maybe some of her questions. But the point here is that this Greek mythology does reflect cultural changes, and I think that's another. Honestly, I think that's another important point, because as Penny and Jang pointed out, I think it's even generally accepted that in the Paleolithic, we're going to do that at a later stage. In the Paleolithic and Neolithic, the goddesses were predominant. What that means is illustrated by what I said about the matrilineal earlier. The matrilineal approaches tended to include men, and the patrilineal tended to exclude women. So that's, I think, a clear difference. But well, let's go to the next slide here. I'll just tell you the story of the vengeance murders, because Clytemnestra is not the first one to follow this pattern. It was Rhea, the goddess, the first goddess, a goddess in the first generation, who killed her, didn't kill her husband, but took vengeance on her husband because her husband ate all the children. Which, you know, I've known that since I was a kid, but this story since I was a kid was kind of a shock to hear that. So here's the story. Cronus and Uranus are both Greek. Oh, here it is. The Furies are the result of a vengeance murder within a family, a son killing a father. Cronus and Uranus were both Greek deities. Uranus was Cronus's father. The Cronus castrates Uranus as revenge for Uranus eating his other children. Also, Zeus was not eaten. The blood from Uranus's wounds fell onto Gaia, the earth goddess. And then the Furies arise from the blood-soaked earth in order to torment Kronos. And then, as we have seen, the Furies endure and become avengers of all kindred spirits. I don't know, I would just, you know, these women were pretty nasty too. I mean, that's, and you have there are some nasty goddesses along the lines of these very nasty gods you've got. By the way, Rhea was the wife of Uranus and the mother of Cronus, and she incited her son to castrate her husband for eating the children. So that's just a little more of the background on this pattern of behavior that is deified here, embodied in these gods. Let's go on to the next slide. Oh, and here's just a more interesting, I'll try to do this kind of by the way, because I think it's very interesting. The Furies were the predominant form of justice. And, you know, I just offer for Ella's consideration, these are not nice ladies. They are out to kill people without a trial. And but viewed from another perspective, the more of a looking back, or not even looking back, the Greeks were in some ways very in touch with the psychological. The justice, the kind of justice that was pointed at by the Furies included not just the retribution, which is flagged here, not just the vengeance murder without a trial. It's also guilt and shame, because the Furies were known for unceasingly singing songs into perpetrators' heads. And this song is what we understand today as guilt. The perpetrators, the kind of guilt perpetrators feel after committing a crime. So, the Greeks, like other more primitive peoples, tended to personify these psychological phenomena, just as we have a different understanding of them. Shame is the same way. Even when there's no overt retribution, so there's no vengeance killing, the Furies occasion the perpetrator's shame based on the fact that others know of the crime and may shun perpetrators of crime. This is a variation of ostracism, which was a big concern for the Greeks. And it's even captured, this is a psychological concept that's carried on to today, you know, what is shame? And it's really different ways of defining it, but one is that guilt is what you know, the way you feel, even if nobody else knows what you did. Shame is the way you feel because you know others know what you did. And the fear of isolation is a big part of that shame, the feeling of shame. And that's flagged even by philosophers like Adam Smith, who wrote a text, Theory of Moral Sentiments. Okay, let's go on. So the Furies were eclipsed by Athena, but the Furies did not disappear. This is a kind of an interesting point, and the Furies were shocked. This is a quote from the book by Dodge. The Furies were shocked and dismayed by Athena's decision to acquit Orestes, and then they vowed vengeance on the entire city of Athens. But Athena dissuades the Furies by offering them a position in the new Athenian order, and the Furies accept. So in effect, they're pacified. Going forward, the Furies are known as the Eumenides, and that means the kindly ones or the happy ones. And these Eumenides were charged with defending both Athenian democracy and trial by jury. So they switched over from vengeance killing to what we consider more civilized. Athena also installed them in a cave under Athens. And this figuratively makes the Furies part of the Athenian foundation, the foundations of Athenian democracy, while at the same time driving them underground. So taking them off the stage. Okay, can we go on? What happened to the Greek goddesses? This again is picking up more, I think, on what Ella's more immediate concerns. This is a summary. The first 2 points are a summary that the Bronze Age gods and goddesses were diminished by Iron Age gods and goddesses. But now I'll get into really my final points, that all the goddesses and gods were eventually eclipsed by Greek philosophy. They were eclipsed by Orthodox Christianity, and I also put in here they were eclipsed by science. And then I kind of have a footnote here. It seems that nature-focused deities became less important than human activity deities. And that nature-focused deities sometimes were repurposed to be deities of human activity. And I think that's a shift more from again, going back to the Paleolithic, which we've not yet presented yet in this series, but we will present, when nature predominated in human life over cities, the if you will, rural life predominated over the city life, the goddesses dominated because they were more closely associated with nature. They continued to be closely associated with nature, probably more so than the gods, but cities became more important. And then even at the beginning of cities, as Zheng signaled, and we've already demonstrated, or at least illustrated this with Inanna and Isis, the beginning of civilization is ascribed to women. And I think there's, good historical background for that mythological approach. So let's go to the next slide. What happened to the Greek goddesses? In Greek philosophy happened to the goddesses, and I want to say as well as to the gods. Philosophy shifted away from anthropomorphized goddesses and gods to explain and justify phenomena. And they shifted, in the next line here, they shifted towards a broad range of metaphors and general principles for those explanations and justifications. And that's part of the axial age, as identified by people who've looked closely at this. And I think there's something to that. I just want to spend a moment on the metaphors and kind of explain how that evolved. If you say that Athena is wise, then Athena is embodying wisdom. But grammatically, look at the sentence. Athena is wise. That's an adjective. Wise is an adjective. And there was a time in history when that kind of a characteristic, like being wise, was not detached or dissociated from a body, from a person, or from people. There was no wisdom apart from a person There was no wisdom as a separate concept. There was no wisdom as a generalization. And the generalization came when you take this adjective and turn it into a noun. And then you say that wisdom, Athena is wisdom, or wisdom is Athena. You can then play around with it a bit more. Or wisdom is other things. But or wisdom, Athena embodies wisdom. They're when you go from this adjective to the noun, that's to me is the easiest way to explain it. From an attribute of an individual to a noun, you can start to work with metaphors. Like Athena is wisdom, that's a metaphor. Whereas Athena is wise is an anthropomorphic statement. So that's a big shift. And I think that's pretty well established, at least in the German language. I know a bit about the history of the German language, but I think it's probably true in these other languages as well. And then the other thing is that, and I think this is important, and we'll get into it again with the Jewish history, female and male messengers from both gods and goddesses were also threatened, discounted, and dismissed in favor of philosophers. So priests and priestesses that engaged in divination and predictions are simply brushed, and again, I'm talking over centuries, are generally brushed aside. When I say generally, it wasn't always true. People still are looking for divination and predictions. And the history of witches of Europe is based in part on the persecution of women who were engaged in divination and healing practices, which threatened the patriarchal Catholic hierarchy. So again, this is it's something we'll get into a bit more in the next presentation, but I think that's probably a fair statement. Philosophy just has the tendency of doing away with these messengers from deities. Okay, the next slide. Now there's limits on philosophy. And again, this ties into what we'll touch on more next week, or next month, which is, and I wrote here, most Western contemporary theologians agree that popular religion needs anthropomorphized gods. So the limit of philosophy is you can't just go with general principles. You need a God because, it says here, because God with human attributes cannot be eliminated because objects of religious devotion must have language and other features to which humans can relate. Humans want to communicate with their gods and they want to be able to relate to them. And in fact, the Greek god and goddesses persisted until about let's say is a very important trend, until 500 in the Common Era, when they were eliminated by Christianity. So let's go to the next slide. So I guess also, if just to anticipate a bit next week's presentation, this point that was in the last slide, that the limits of philosophy, Western theologians think you can't have a God unless it's personified. What happened in the Jewish tradition was they kept the personification of God as a male after they eliminated his consort Asherah. So by default, if you will, the god was male, and that's not. I don't think that's necessarily agreed in all cultures. That's just the way it's evolved in this Western tradition. So what happened to the Greek goddesses? Orthodox Christianity. This is a big thing. The Christians attacked the Greek goddesses vociferously and violently. For example, at around 400 AD, The Christians attacked them for two reasons: because they were one out of many. The Christians supported monotheism, and also because they were women. And there is a trend, as I kind of presaged here, or anticipated a bit in my previous statement. There is a men are preferred over women in the Judeo-Christian Trinity, and that really was a very consistent policy that endured over centuries, even millennia at this point, because goddesses are really generally tend to be very well loved. And so here's one example. In Ephesus, Ephesus was a cultic center for Artemis. It was a big city in general on the Aegean coast of Turkey. But one of the big temples there, the biggest temple there, was the temple to Artemis that we've already talked about. And Paul attacked that Greek goddess as worship of her as adultery. And that was in 53 to 56 CE, the Common Era, and he was driven out of town for that, and I suppose other reasons. But then finally, after the Christians established themselves as the state religion, the Christians destroyed her temple. And this was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. So this is the kind of thing. There are, I haven't really checked this out, but there are many scholars who think the Christians destroyed the library in Alexandria, and that the Christians destroyed what was called that was part of what was called the museum, which was a kind of like a university in Alexandria. And there were women who were very prominent, and they were attacked, pushed out, and sometimes killed. This is, again, I haven't checked this, but there are reports that they were killed by the Christians. The Christians were rather orthodox at that point. So the next slide. So that's it. I'm interested in new concepts or insights that you have. I'm willing to stay if people want to talk. Confirmations and reflections of old concepts and insights. Any additions or disagreements? Ella, I appreciate what Ella and Nir said on that point. Reflections on your life experiences, which Ella also touched on. I think that's really important. Comparisons with Western traditions and or Indian Chinese traditions. That's something that I can't really bring so well, but Cheng touched on that nicely. Just reminds us that this is just one part of the world. Then any other comments or questions?
If anyone has any comments or questions, you can either type exclamation point in chat or raise your hand in Zoom. And I see Dave is up first.
Yeah, I was very interested saying that Western philosophy started about 500 BC. And as soon as Joe and I are studying Stoicism with some others, that I think that's about the date they state for some of the early Stoics is about 500 BC. So it does really coincide. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Jing.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting to learn the history of these rivals between the woman and man. I'm just curious. It seems people easily, why there's just like race and gender, why people are so obsessed. I'm just curious from human psychology, I actually don't see a lot of difference between a man and woman in general. So, but I think for some reason, people pay way too much attention in the race and gender, to my opinion. I think human are human in general, you know, and they have different personalities. So anyway, that's what I'm curious. Why there's a big war between man and woman? And now, you know, women have more power than some people represent the man feel threatened. Actually, I think the man-dominant society is actually not good for men because they have so much responsibilities. So I remember there's a story about this Taiwanese guy who actually invests in so many houses in Taiwan. You know, I'm from mainland China. I think one of the only good thing Chairman Mao did is liberate women. So in that Cultural Revolution, women and men all equal. So that's why you see a lot of women engineers from China, you know, like women do working too, you know, most of the women in China working. So I think that's really doing women in a positive way. But, you know, most of Taiwan women, after they graduate from college, they usually be full-time mom. And this guy, you know, because of the financial storm, he lost money, couldn't afford the house. He ended up killing his kids and his wife and himself. So it's kind of like, you know, I think the man-dominant society is not really good for men. For women in that society, if you want to work, you can work. If you don't want, you can rely on other people. But for men, you have to. You can rely on other people. It's actually, I think equality is good for everybody. You know, you basically you have two things to rely on. You don't rely on one person who carry all the burden. So to my opinion, it's a win-win for everybody.
May I comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of your points is really anticipated by what Evanique said, in that now the like male and female, what traits have been considered male and female are to some extent disassociated from the gender, from men or women. And some of the feminine traits exist in men as well as in women. And so that's a step beyond the moving from personification to metaphor. It's really more of a, I don't really have a word for it right now, but it's more of a generalization, a recognition that these traits are not necessarily tied to a particular gender. And otherwise, I kind of agree with much. I agree with a lot of what you said. I think that's very interesting.
Thank you, Brian. Up next, I have Kevin.
Thank you, Brian and Evanique. Yeah, got a question about one time I got a couple last week. They said, "What's the God name?" So this in Christian we don't see that. However, I see the four letter, right? YHWH. When you read it from right to left, and one slide you saw that is Yahwehist. Why? I think about God is godliness. Original that could be the lady, not a goddess. It's about the word itself. Basically, we slowly change the meaning from God. Okay, that's used to be belongs to a lady, so we change it to male like focused. So this interest for me. For another way, think about it. It's in a Tao, right? We know the first one. Tao can be named. It's not eternal Tao. Name can be named. It's not eternal name. So that's translated. Then also same thing in the John Bible, right? God is the word. God is the word. How that? God is the word. This word is what's the secret about HWHUI? That is in 2 days. So I would get you guys input. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Does anybody have any input?
Well, I would say that in addition to I'd say generally, it's my impression that the Indians and the Chinese have a much better, the wisdom traditions have probably a more developed or flexible understanding of gender differences. We have this tradition in the West where and this exists, I think, also in, I don't know, but I'm guessing it, from what I've seen, the personification of deities also exists in the East. But to the extent that we're looking at, the Taoist texts or some of the Upanishads, they're at a very early period, the Chinese and the Indians got away from the personification of these eternal, ever-present forces that people tend to refer to as deities or the divine. So I think that's one thing. The Yahweh, these 4 letters, the old Hebrew alphabet, and I think still the alphabet today, is it doesn't have vowels, it just has consonants. And honestly, I don't know that they're spelling left to right when they put it down those 4 letters. It might be right to left, but as an accommodation. But there's just a very long history on these words, and each word is used to capture a different understanding of this divinity. But I think, I mean, if people are interested in this, I'll present it for next time. I think it's pretty clear that that this Hebrew, Israeli, Yahwist, Jewish, Christian tradition, almost by default, but very intentionally, has imagined God as a male, and not just male characteristics or that men and women share, as a man, personification. And then, it goes through the Jewish, I think, tradition didn't go through the same evolution, certainly not as early or as quickly as the Greek, because of this limitation of philosophy, which I flagged, that in the West, and I think that people believed, people felt, and it was certainly reflected in the, I think, intellectual history, that you can't relate to God unless he has human characteristics, including gender and language. And I think the Jewish, I'm going to look at it again this next month, but in my, right now, I have the impression that the Jewish tradition hung on to the gender-related understanding of the divine much longer than Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy under Plato was talking about ideals, the good, the true, the beautiful, and not talking about some personification. In the Jewish Bible, they talk about God created heaven and earth, and the Word was with God. So there was, first of all, there was a God, a personification, and he spoke. This is in Genesis. He spoke the world into being. That is changed in John, where most people think through Greek influence, but it's not just Greek influence, through evolution, that God doesn't speak the word, so there's no God before the word. God is the word. But even that is this is such a long and in some ways kind of a tortured history. This John 1 is practically identical to verses out of Proverbs in the Old Testament, and I'll present that next time, where it says God is the Word. It was that, and the Word was with God. It used to be wisdom was at the beginning of creation together with God. And they didn't use the word God. They had other words for it, like El or Elohim. There are a lot of different words for God in Jewish history because it's a fairly long history. And but whatever word they used for God, they said he was there with wisdom. In Proverbs, it says that, and that wisdom was a woman. So wisdom was the consort of God in that very old, that goes way, way back. Solomon, if it's described as Solomon, it goes way back to the copper. Well, I can't really say, but it's certainly early Bronze Age.
Thank you, Brian. Does anybody else have any more questions or comments? If not, I want to say thank you to Brian and Penny for putting this presentation together.
Are people interested in having the Jewish presented? I'd like some indication of interest in this.
Yes.
Because again, this is
oh.
kind of, I'm trying to answer, I was not planning to present any of this. And Evanique and I were not planning on this at all. We're trying to be responsive to a very clear request from several people at the last session. If there's no interest, then I won't do it.
I think there is some interest. I see people saying yes in the chat.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah. I would
Um,
say, I think it's very interesting. I've been reading the books too, and just to say that, I mean, a lot of the Old Testament is the Hebrew people, the Levites, priests fighting against the goddess worship in Canaan where they went, because that's who lived there, were goddess worshiping Canaanites. And so it's very interesting to really realize the long history of trying to promote their ideas over goddess. And it was a long time. And this was not an easy change in society.
Ella, did you want to say something?
Yes, and my thought is that the Kabbalah might be something to include as well. It really does start with the male-dominated theme, so that might be an interesting part to include.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and I've got it pretty well sketched out already. I just haven't put it in the slides. I don't have the Kabbalah in there. I'll take a look, but if you could bring that as well, your understanding of that to the meetup, that would be really appreciated.
Yeah, I was surprised when I did just a couple of times, just read through some things in the Kabbalah, how women were really treated and thought of. And it was because I liked many aspects of it, but it was not something that I just didn't understand that that's where, mythically it's interesting, but women are, didn't that precede the Torah?
Not that I know of. I have never heard of that. So
Is it totally separate then? I mean,
Well,
it's
I'm
Jewish.
not an expert on Jewish history. I'm presenting this. I'm just presenting. I'm starting with the thread. The thread that I'm following is the what happened to the goddesses And if you remember, on the Greeks, I said it's a shifting hierarchy. And I
Right.
tried to present that today. But at the end, with the Christians and philosophy, it does clearly, I think, go over to the goddesses are swept away. But the point I'm trying to make, at least with the Greeks, is that also the gods were swept away. And so it's a nuanced picture in Greece. I think it's less of a nuanced picture in the Jewish tradition. And to get at that, I'm relying on this book from Edward Dodge, which I think is really a good book, and I'd recommend it. But and then the other things I've learned over the years, just from reading a lot about the Old Testament and Jewish history. But I would say practically every main point I have for next week is in this book from Edward Dodge, because I think he's done a great job with it. And but I probably am going to add a little more nuance than even he does, although I think he really does a good job. For example, yes, well, you said, for example, Ella, tonight you said that the women were enslaved. Yeah, that's true. Men were enslaved too. So it's not, I think it's, yeah, if you want to, and a lot of these books do that, the books that I've looked at, yeah, they focus, if you want to just focus on what happened to the goddesses, then a lot of this research, a lot of this writing talks only about the goddesses, only about the status of women, but men and gods also suffered in the intellectual and real history. And I think that's also undeniable. It's just, but I think the trend has been, especially in the Western tradition, I'm not taken away, I'm just trying to add from what you said. I think that in the Western tradition, I think you're absolutely right, but I think and I hope we're headed more towards a rebalancing.
Yeah, Ella, just to add, Kabbalism is more Jewish mysticism than it is with the Torah, so it's outside of the realm of the Bible.
Yeah, I thought it might have been preceded the Bible, and but it could be totally separate. I'd have to look up the dates and see, but yeah, it is a mystic type of the Kabbalah is mystical. And I like some aspects of it, but like I said, it's all about women being subservient. And yeah, so it's not connected, you're saying, with the Torah at all.
So as far as I know, no, it's not connected to the Torah.
If I may, Kabbalah tends to see itself as uncovering or revealing an esoteric aspect of the Bible.
Of the
It's
traditional
saying that,
Bible,
the Bible
or
is authoritative. Yeah, the Jewish Bible. It's saying that the Bible is authoritative, but the Bible should not be understood in its simple way, in its literal way.
If I might also add, since we've been anticipating a bit next week, just as with the Greek, I think there's some nuance. All of those Iron Age points, I think, are still out there. But the Hebrews were probably one of those tribes like the Amorites who came in and attacked the cities. And then that's at the very early era. Now that may or may not be true. There are people who contest that. But I think it is clear that like Israel Finkelstein, if people have heard of him, he's an archaeologist who's done a lot of work in this area. And but I think it is true when we get into the history, as opposed to the archaeology, that the Jewish elites were looking to distinguish themselves from Canaanite elites. In other words, Jewish is just a name for one of the peoples that lived in Canaan. And it was, it got its own, it was called Judah. The north of that was called Israel. North of that, it had other names, but it's part of the initial, and Gaza is another name, Philistia. There are a lot of different names for all the different peoples who lived there over time. And but as it happened in world history, the Jews were one of the last standing, if you will, and then they also, through the book, have perpetuated their faith, and then through the adoption of Christianity, this faith has become, as adapted by the Christians, has become a predominant faith in the West. And it used to be the predominant faith. So it really has an importance, but I think that it's pretty clear from the history, at least that I've read, that the Jewish elite that came from Babylon, and even before that with Josiah and some of the other Yahwist kings, they were looking to distinguish themselves from the Canaanites around them. And the Canaanites around them believed in goddesses. And so one way they could distinguish themselves was to do away with goddess worship. And so there was in Solomon's temple, there was it's called a pole, which is really just probably a derivative or an expression of the tree of life. There was a symbol of the goddess in Solomon's temple. And it was cut down by Josiah, one of the Yahwist kings, to do away with the worship of the goddess in Solomon's temple. So there we know, at least if we accept this story, and most people do, that Solomon worshipped and allowed the worship of the goddess in the first temple, the temple he built. But then the Yahwists, one of them being Josiah, came in and did away with that. And there was a lot of back and forth about that over the centuries, because sometimes, and another center of power was Samaria, and the capital there, they embraced the polytheistic approach with a god and goddess. And I have never teased out from all of these texts, I guess maybe I have some inferences, but never teased out, why is it that the Yahwists decided to be a god rather than a goddess? The only things I can come up with go back to those Iron Age considerations, because they were a tribe that, if you believe the Bible, they were a tribe that came in. They were more of a herding tribe, like the Amorites. The Amorites brought Marduk into Babylon. He was a male god, and that's the best pattern I can see as an explanation, that the Jews brought in their male god as a herding culture, and they kept it after they became settled.
Thank you, Brian. If anybody else doesn't have any comments, thank you all for coming and your participation, and have a great night. And we will see you next month. I'm giving it 30 seconds.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.